Have you ever wondered why you suddenly lose motivation for the things you used to love? One day you're full of energy, ready to conquer your goals, and the next, you can barely get yourself out of bed. It's not that you've become lazy or unproductive. Your brain might simply be running low on dopamine, the chemical that fuels your drive. Today I'll break down why that happens, how your daily habits may be quietly draining your motivation, and most importantly, how to reset your dopamine naturally so you can feel focused and alive again. Stay until the end because I'll share a simple mindset shift that can completely change how you experience effort and reward. Recently, I found myself stuck in a cycle of low energy and no drive. Even the things I used to enjoy, hobbies, goals, small routines, stopped feeling rewarding. So, I started digging for answers and came across a fascinating podcast that explained the real science behind motivation. It all comes down to one powerful neurotransmitter, dopamine. Understanding how dopamine works and how to balance it changed everything for me. And if you've been feeling burned out, tired, or unmotivated, it might change everything for you too. Dopamine isn't just the pleasure chemical people talk about. It's actually your drive system. It's what makes you take action, pursue goals, and find meaning in progress. Without dopamine, even simple things like eating, learning, or exercising would feel pointless. Think of dopamine as your internal battery. When it's charged, you feel inspired and motivated. When it's drained, even small tasks feel exhausting. But dopamine doesn't stay at one level. It operates on two scales. Baseline, your normal everyday level. Peak, the temporary high you feel from something exciting or rewarding. Let's say your baseline is at a 2, and when you experience something fun, like watching your favorite show, your dopamine spikes to a 4. That's normal. But here's the catch. Once that spike fades, your levels don't just go back to 2. They dip below it for a while. This drop below baseline is what causes the crash after intense pleasure or reward. That's why after big achievements like finishing a degree, landing a job, or even binge watching a show you've been waiting for, you might feel unexpectedly low afterward. Your brain simply needs time to reset. The same principle applies to smaller, repeated dopamine hits, constant social media scrolling, fast food or sweets, gaming marathons, online shopping sprees. Each of these gives your brain a short-term dopamine spike, but if done too often, they lower your baseline, meaning your overall motivation starts to fade. You don't have separate dopamine banks for each activity. It's all one shared system. If you keep spiking it, your baseline stays low, and that's when you start feeling tired, unfocused, and unmotivated, even if nothing in your life has changed. So how do you reset your dopamine and get your drive back? Let's look at a common example. Imagine you've just joined a gym. To make workouts more enjoyable, you bring your favorite music, drink an energy drink, and train with a friend. You even promise yourself a treat afterward. Nothing wrong with that. But here's the hidden trap. You've trained your brain to depend on all those external boosts to start an activity. If even one is missing, say your friend can't join or your playlist feels stale, your motivation drops. To avoid this, try what scientists call intermittent reinforcement. Basically, change up your dopamine triggers. Some days, work out without music. Other times, skip the energy drink. Try different times of day. This prevents your brain from expecting constant pleasure just to take action. By adding small challenges or variety, you teach your brain to find reward in the effort itself, not just in the reward at the end. This concept is supported by a well-known Stanford study. Researchers found that when kids who naturally loved drawing started receiving gold stars as rewards, they eventually lost interest in drawing once the rewards stopped. Their brains had learned to connect joy with the reward, not the process. The same thing happens to adults. If you exercise just for the reward, like a treat, a body goal, or validation, your motivation disappears once those rewards fade. The fix? Tell yourself, the effort is the reward. That simple mindset shift changes everything. Over time, Your brain begins releasing dopamine during the effort, not just after it. It's the difference between dragging yourself to the gym versus genuinely enjoying the feeling of discipline, focus, and growth, even when it's hard. Here's what to remember. Dopamine is your battery. Every spike drains it, so protect it by limiting overstimulation. You only have one system. Balance pleasure with patience to keep your baseline healthy. Shift your focus from reward to effort. That's where real motivation lives. When you start finding joy in the process, your drive returns, naturally, sustainably, and from within.